Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Hillsboro 101 training, Planning for a Complete Community. I think this will be a very interesting work session or work sessions. We have, just for those of you in attendance, we'll have a work session before the meeting about Hillsboro 101, Planning for a Complete Community. Then we'll do the meeting, the city council meeting, and then we'll come back in here and do this meeting as a continuation. Thanks to everyone for being here. I appreciate it. And I'll turn it over to Robbie.
Thanks, Mayor. So as you all know, we've been doing these Hillsboro 101 work sessions now for a few months. Today, we're going to take you up to an even higher level and talk about overall, as the city of Hillsboro grows, which we are doing very quickly, what things do we take into account? How do we grow? What factors do we need to consider? We have a lot of slides tonight, 72, which is why, as the mayor mentioned, we'll do a pre and post council work session. But I would encourage us today to kind of remain at that higher level, because we have those other 101 sessions where we can take deeper dives into a lot of these different topics. We will have breaks throughout to offer time for questions like we've done the last several meetings. And if there's anything really in depth that will take some time, then I'll talk to you separately about sending an email to you and council after the meeting. So with that, I will turn it over. Who starts? Dan?
Thanks, Robbie. And tonight's presentation is brought really by a collaboration of multiple departments, as you'll hear. A brief overview of the agenda, as Robbie mentioned, is talking a bit about the different citywide systems plans and master plans, ranging from transportation, land use, park, sanitary sewer, storm sewer, water, and library. And then that'll be at a citywide scope. And then we will break it down into some target growth areas to show how the iterativeness of thinking citywide to then thinking sub-geographies to then making it happen, and provide towards the end of the presentation some examples of coordination across our departments and how we also work with external stakeholders to deliver upon those plans. Similar to what we've done with other presentations, there's a lot of different policy bases, especially given the breadth of the areas to be covered, but some of the most pertinent are listed on this slide, ranging from the 2035 community plan. We'll talk about that throughout this evening. The comprehensive plan, a lot of the master plans that we'll be speaking very directly to. But one thing that will only be lightly touched on tonight is many of these infrastructure provisions and land use provisions especially are also very much guided or directed by state statute and rules, and in some cases federal programs as well. So we will elaborate those. This is not an exhaustive list. So the first bit really then frames when we think about complete community planning, and you may have seen recent City View articles where we were talking about this. It really is something that takes a holistic approach and a high-level approach, but keeps the implementation goals in mind. And so with that, one of the core functions of our city is to continue to plan for the community's health and viability, both near-term and long-term. And this informs things that many of us think about when we think about what makes Hillsboro great. And we hear this in news articles, we hear it from the public and the community. And it is our places, it is our neighborhoods, it's our parks, it's our events and activities. But that structure, the enabling pieces of that, comes out of the planning work that we'll be talking about tonight. We are also a community that has been really incrementally building and growing, especially for the last few decades. And we'll talk about that throughout tonight, but especially at the very tail end. And so one thing that comes to mind is where and how do we continue to exist as a community? So a lot of what we talk about tonight will be in 5-year increments or 20-year increments or sometimes longer. But it's important that we continue to keep that collectivity in mind, because it is the coordination of those plans that helps to allow continuity of where we're going. And it also allows us to then respond when environments or circumstances may also change. So the structure of what you're going to hear tonight, and really what goes into that complete community planning aspect, are the utility and the infrastructure master plans that you're going to hear tonight. And those will be over very specific service areas or utilities. And you see that represented in the circle up at the top. That interfaces with the Hillsboro Comprehensive Plan. Talk more about that in a minute, but that really is kind of the master plan that takes into account land uses and really adopts and seeks to bring together those different utility master plans. The fiscal sustainability of those services and our growth is captured somewhat in each of those master plans in the comprehensive plan, but also gets reflected in the budget. We've talked about that at your very first Hillsboro 101. So elements of that will make its way into some of the conversation tonight, even though we won't hyper focus on that. And then just as importantly is then on the left-hand side is the 2035 community plan. And that's really where We get community engagement and input in all of these plans in a variety of different ways, but that is a very concise effort and document for our community really to lay out its desires and aspirations and what it wants to be. And those elements make their way into our citywide strategic plan. They also make their way into the updates and the policies and the programs that make their way in those other 3 dots. And so collectively, that's what allows Hillsboro to not only get the recognition for, but position itself and deliver upon that notion of having a very complete and vibrant community, both today and moving forward. So this slide is a little bit of a residual one. We've received some questions from the council and from leadership around the Oregon's land use system, and it is a bit unique in our state, but it really is an underpinning of and a framer of a lot of the work that we do in this space. There isn't a good or easy way to really lay out the full Oregon land use history and context. We try to do that in the form of this timeline. This timeline does not capture all of the major policy actions or pivots that have happened really since the land use system started back in 1973. And similarly, I'm not going to cover all of them tonight because this could have been 25 slides unto itself. But I will highlight a couple of important ones. When we are doing this complete community planning, we have to keep in mind Senate Bill 100, which really established a state down to local level land use planning system. And when we are updating our comprehensive plan or thinking about our housing plan, some of the recent conversations we've been having with council, we have to demonstrate alignment and compliance with state rules, state goals, and state requirements. And so to that end, we get a decent amount of autonomy to plan for our own city and have local community input into that. But we are working within the program parameters of that state land use system that was established in the Senate Bill 100, 1973. You'll hear us talk a lot in that space around the aligning with the 19 land use goals, and not all 19 apply to Hillsboro because there's some around like beach and dune preservation that obviously doesn't apply to us. There's things around like the Willamette River corridor and view sheds that doesn't apply to us, but there are a lot in here around public engagement and outreach, housing, transportation, natural resources and cultural resources, the economy that you do hear us refer to, and that makes its way into those plans. Another important piece I think to flag is that in 1978, and this is not on the slide, Metro was established by the voters in the region. And then in 1992, Metro's charter was updated to bolster Metro as a regional level of government, its role in reviewing and coordinating and setting some of the region's planning efforts. And so our local efforts to plan for 20 years, whether we're thinking transportation or utilities or housing, has to be done in coordination with, and oftentimes then align or comply with, regional level programs and requirements in addition to some of the state level programs and requirements. So we want to flag that for some of the context that will come up later in the presentation. And then lastly is parallel to that, in 2000 is when the city adopted its first vision. And while that was really echoed in part of some of the land use system goals, especially around community engagement and visioning, it really was an effort by our city to have the community express what are some of the things that it wanted to pursue, start to identify what partners would be needed to make those ideas actionable. And so really since about that 2000 timeframe, that 2020 vision, which was done in 2000, which ultimately became the 2035 community plan, has been really that guiding beacon of the community's voice throughout the work, and then we build off of that. So I'm going to start and hit the comprehensive plan. This has been discussed in last couple of Hillsboro one-on-one sessions. So I'm going to try to briefly review this and then hand it off to Matt to really get into new substance really around transportation systems plans. But just a refresher that the comprehensive plan is just that. It is comprehensive in nature. It's required by state law to be that, and it functions locally as that. It includes the items on the screen before you, as well as additional pieces, but a lot of the things we've talked about in past 101. So when we think about land use plans and designations, it identifies where are certain regional centers or town centers, and that informs the type of amenities or transportation or densities we're looking at. It will identify corridors, which become important when we overlap into the transportation space or the connectivity space. There are policies and programs in this plan around preserving historic and cultural resources and how we identify those and how we seek to protect those and recognize those. And again, that's an alignment piece back up to that state level program I mentioned a minute ago. You've been heavily engaged already as a new council in housing policies and housing program work. We've talked about that, but that is all embedded in here. I'll talk just a little bit more about that here in a minute. And then a lot of the master plans, again, citywide utility master plans, which is the bulk of the presentation tonight, as well as geographic focus areas. Sometimes we refer to as master plans, or you'll hear community plans. So for South Hillsboro or Amber Glen or downtown, those refined area plans seek to focus in those citywide master plans. Those are also contained in the comprehensive plan. We have guiding documents for our economic goals and pursuits. That shows up in the economy sections. And then lastly, and just as importantly, identifications for public facilities and goals around sustainability also make their way into that policy and plan document. And from that, a lot of additional programs spur. But I just want to reiterate the fact that the comprehensive plan is for a 20-year horizon typically, and we periodically refresh that, sometimes with minor amendment packages. Those go through our planning commission with recommendations to the council. They always include some degree of community engagement. And then we'll do holistic updates. We just completed one of these right at the end of like 2018 timeframe. And that is a holistic refresh of those plans. But again, we'll talk about that more in a minute. The three key pillars of which you've already heard that really inform the land use aspects of the comprehensive plan are the economic opportunities analysis. We talked about that in the Economy 101 presentation, the housing needs analysis, which identifies the 20-year housing needs and an inventory of what current housing is, as well as a projection of the future types of housing needs that we should be trying to enable within the community. And then the housing production strategy, which is relatively new over the last couple of years as a result of state legislation, but that is seeking to bring tools forward to continue to encourage the very type of housing production that we've identified in the housing needs analysis. And so those three pieces really inform the land use part of our comprehensive plan. There's other pieces in there like our Goal 5 natural resource program too, but those are the three critical policy pieces unto themselves that you recently have made decisions on as well. And that's really important because those things then establish what is the type of infrastructure that we both have in place today and that we need to be thinking about as we turn it over to our friends in water and public works and parks as we plan for those community needs, both near term and long term. So this is review. I won't hit all these, but these are some of the findings from each of those three land use policy documents. And this is, again, looking out for the 20-year need that will then correlate to some of the other master plans you're going to hear about here in just a minute. Those were last updated in the 2021 to 2023 timeframe. The housing needs analysis, similarly, we presented that during the Housing 101 session, but just to come back in terms of what is the forecasted need of new units above and beyond. On the right-hand side is a map that's been requested by a couple of the councilors that seeks to map out, now at a citywide level, so it can be hard to read, but where we do have built out and vacant areas for housing. And we'll drill more into that at future presentations, but that is a big piece of how much additional capacity of infill do we have or densification versus how much new capacity do we need. That definitely informs our conversations around growth and provision of infrastructure and services. And then lastly, the housing production strategy. And as some of you may have heard at the last work session, this was recently remanded to us by the Department of Land Conservation and Development. So basically the state's planning agency. We are evaluating internally and will be coming forward at a future council work session with options and recommended steps to move forward on how to respond to that front. But again, there's a lot of tools and programs that were already underway. We plan to continue to advance those based on the council's direction, but we'll be back there. So promise to keep the comprehensive plan and land use piece brief. Now I'll hand it over to Matt to talk about the transportation systems plan.
Good evening. I'm Matt Delata. I lead the transportation system division. So I'm going to talk about the transportation system plan, which really guides our transportation system development going into the future. But I'll talk about our plan specifically in just a minute. But the first piece for you all to know is that we don't just have carte blanche to do whatever we want to do. We're working within the structure of the state, the region, and the county. So they each all have their own transportation policies and plans as you might expect. A big one is the state transportation planning rule that they put together that really sets the structure and the guidelines for what we have to do in a transportation system plan. And that's really been updated in the last couple of years with the climate friendly and equitable community. So there's, when we go and do our next transportation system plan update, there'll be some new requirements and regulations and processes that we'll have to follow leading up to that. Then Metro, as the regional metropolitan planning organization, they try to align with our transportation system plan. So we give them information. They also give us information. We try to work together and partner on those things, but they have their own structure and guidelines that then affects what we do. Similar at the county, we partner very closely with the county on a lot of the roadways. And they do their own TSP, which ends up looking fairly similar to ours, although obviously at a higher level given the geography that they have to cover. Slide, please. So our TSP was just updated in 2022. The main thing that it does, it really serves as a blueprint for our transportation planning. A couple of notes about that. The way that the TSP works is it zooms out to the future, 20 years out ahead. We have a horizon year of 2040, and we look at that horizon year of 2040 with population growth and employment growth all assumed, and then we say, okay, what are our needs looking out 20 years? And that's really the structure, the assumption that that's all based off of. Let's build out to that. What kind of transportation system do we want? What kind of transportation system do we need? And it's also multimodal, right? We're looking at the roadways, motor vehicle traffic, but we're also looking at bicycle travel, all active transportation travel, transit, etc. So we're trying to cover all of that. Some of the key things that we put together is the functional class map. So that defines the hierarchy of the roadways, the intended function of the different roadways. And so when we say, evergreen is going to be an arterial roadway, that means it's going to be designed to a certain cross section. There's going to be certain sidewalk widths, planter strips, all that's going to be defined. And then we're going to hold ourselves to that standard, and we're going to hold developers to that standard because that's the plan the community has agreed upon. In addition to the roadway system, we've got pedestrian plans. So that's generally sidewalks, but also other facilities, signals plan of where we're going to put the traffic signals, bicycle plan. So we've got different types of bicycle facilities all over the city. So that's defining which roadways get which type of facilities. And then freight plan, right? We're trying to capture all the different potential users of the transportation system here. And then we're also trying to protect sometimes right away so that, we might not need this by 2040, but we can see out ahead that we might need that afterwards. The end result of all this work, and there's a significant degree of community engagement involved in all of this, as you might expect, is a long project list, 152 projects with 152 roadway projects, 119 intersection improvements. Those roadway projects generally include complete streets, bike sidewalks, bike lanes, etc. With those, we include the estimated timeline, cost estimates, potential funding sources. So it's all planning level, so things evolve over time. But again, it's a blueprint, it's a starting point, lays all that out. Next slide, please. The cost, when you add it up, is $1 billion, roughly. As you can imagine, we don't have $1 billion, but we're trying to identify that system, right? And we know that a lot of that work is going to come through external funding sources, development. We do try to lay that all out and say, okay, what are some potential funding sources that this could be coming from? So it's a 20-year forecast. It's pretty high level at that point, but again, it gives us a good definition of the path forward. What are we striving to achieve? Oh, that's it for me.
I have a question. So for the Hillsboro, for the TSP, it's the roads are only the roads that are owned by the city?
That's a great question.
Just because of the Evergreen example.
Yeah, so that's part of the reason why we're engaged with these other partners is a lot of our roadways might be county roadways or state roadways or whatever else. So we do include those, we plan with those, but we partner with those jurisdictions. So we're not going to go out of step and say, hey, guess what, ODOT? We decided you're going to build a roundabout at this intersection. We're going to have a conversation with them and plan for that and say, hey, are you guys okay with us proposing that? So we're that's both why we look to those high level plans kind of feeding down into our plans and why
Yes.
we ask for them to partner with us when we do that TSP update.
Thanks.
All right, my turn. This is an exciting time for the Parks and Recreation Department. And we're in the final stages of completing and adopting our new Parks and Recreation System Plan with a focus on equity and inclusion. This plan will help us assess our current level of service, but also provide the framework for how we plan to serve the community in the future. Our current plan was developed in 2008, 2009, and was adopted in 2010. So a lot has changed. We've experienced a lot of growth, and our demographics have changed quite a bit. In slide 2, you'll see here, the plan includes a detailed inventory of our current systems of our parks, trails, facilities, programs, and services. This allows us to determine how well we're serving our community, but it also helps us identify gaps. Next slide. The system assessment allows us to leverage the census tract data to analyze how our system is currently being utilized and by who. It also allows us a detailed profile of our parks, our sports field complexes, plazas, trails, open space facilities, and our centers. This analysis also provides us information on service gaps and who's also going to be impacted by the lack of service. Community engagement findings. Community engagement was extremely important to this process. Our focus was on inclusion and also elevating voices that have historically been marginalized. And it was critical in developing 4 key elements of the plan: the vision, community focus areas, recommendations, and also our initial action areas. I'll turn it over to Jerome to provide more detail about those areas.
Okay, thank you. Good evening. I'm Jerome Koch. I'm the Planning and Development Manager with the Parks and Recreation Department. Nice to be here this evening. So next slide, please. The vision statement highlights the main themes that were derived from the community engagement work. They include providing resources and services that are shared evenly, ensuring that the community is actively engaged in decision-making, focusing our effort to enhance physical, emotional, and cultural connections to our facilities and services, designing our facilities and services in a way that provides safety, accessibility, and is welcoming to all. Next slide, please. The initial areas of focus from the planning effort will guide our short-term efforts. They include integrating the many unique communities we've identified and are represented in our city, and how and why we provide facilities and services. We'll also be focusing on providing basic level of services to all areas of our community, which is something that is currently lacking. We'll be focusing on providing safe, welcoming spaces that are universally accessible. We'll be increasing accessibility to facilities and programs by identifying and removing barriers. We'll also be addressing facility and service disparities through targeted investments, and we'll continue to invest in communication efforts and also community involvement to strengthen relationships and connections with our community. Next slide, please. The initial plan recommendations focus on parity and equitable outcomes. So the near-term recommendations are to address gaps identified in the service analysis, add amenities to better serve all in our community, adjust programming locations to better fit where our community needs services. We'll be reinvesting and expanding existing facilities while working to expand our capacity to serve a growing community and diversity of needs. Again, reducing barriers to access, preserve natural areas and features, provide cultural representation in decision-making process, And then finally, continue to work further to address facility and programming enhancements. Next slide, please. So finally, short-term focus areas are rooted in diversity, equity, and inclusion. They include things like covered playgrounds, trails and trailheads, aquatics, facility, splash pads and access to water, event spaces, safety upgrades, land acquisition, covered pavilions, and then also follow-up planning. So these are all messages that we heard throughout the community engagement process through a variety of sources. A lot of these, unsurprisingly, align well with the 2035 plan input that we received from the community as well. So many of these types of projects are reflected in our capital improvement plan, which we just completed and is being reviewed and considered for approval through the current budgeting process.
Really quick before we get to that, one more note on the parks plan. I'm not sure if you mentioned it, but it will be brought to the council later this year for final adoption. I don't know what the timeline is.
I think we're scheduled for June 17th.
Okay.
And in the staff report is a link to our system plan project page. So for those of you who have time and interest, I would encourage you to go there to review it, and feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions as you're reviewing that.
Thanks,
Thank you for
Jerome.
mentioning that.
It's tremendous work, and it's going to be exciting for you all to go through it in June. But yeah, lots to go on the website if you want to take a look at it now. We'll also kind of pause there as well. We've gone through a couple of sections before we get into the library to see if anybody has any questions on any of the previous slides.
I have so what are the basic like what falls under the basic level of service?
Right. Yeah. No, that's a great question. So I think that, the first slide in our presentation laid out the structure of our system. So the basic needs are neighborhood parks, and those are 3 to 5 acre parks. They're located typically within walking distance of people in neighborhoods, and those are scattered throughout the community. But we do have portions of the city that aren't currently served with developed parks. In some cases, we have undeveloped property and just haven't gotten around to developing the parks. In other cases, we're going to need to buy property in order to then construct those parks. Then the next level are the community parks, and those are our larger parks that have typically more amenities. They have parking lots, restrooms, sports fields, all kinds of facilities. So we have a number of those within the city, and we do have some undeveloped community park property to go forward. So, and then I would say that the other kind of the basic level, kind of the bread and butter to the system is the trail system. And we have a variety of trails throughout the city, and we have plans for significantly more trails in the future. We also have community centers. So the Hidden Creek Community Center, Shark Recreation Center. We also have a senior center that provides service for residents in the community. And then we also have special facilities like sports fields, so the Gorham Faber Recreation Complex or the Hidden Creek Park East.
This is all basic. This is in the second slide, that bullet where it says everybody should have the basic, okay.
Right, yeah, I think most communities, those are the kind of
Yes.
the basic elements of a complete parks and recreation
Awesome.
system.
All right, thank you.
Just so the council here knows, Councilor Sinclair is attending online. I've checked in whether she didn't have questions, but I just wanted you all to know.
Thank you.
Okay.
So I have a question. I have a question for each of you, actually, for Dan on the housing production strategies. One of the strategies, and I'm sorry if I haven't read that in detail, but do you include anything about modification of building codes or simplification of building codes, like single stairway, small apartments, or pre-approved smaller units or anything like that, that it could expedite some development of deep metal housing?
To that question, Councilor Harris, there are tools and steps called out in the current version of the housing production strategy that was approved by council that do call out auditing and seeking to address certain parts of our community development code. There are other points where we are trying to coordinate at the state level or the international code level, since the building codes, to the very specific part of your questions, are beyond our local authority. So yes, both are happening, but we do have a little bit of more direct focus and scope on the community development code side versus the building code side.
Perfect, thank you. And Matt, one of the future expenses was $5 million for undergrounding utilities in South Hillsboro. Is that the net cost, or is that going to be recouped through SDCs? Do you know the answer to that? Or is that something that's not related and it's just going to be an expense, a general expense to the city? Didn't I get that right? Didn't I see a $5 million expense for undergrounding in South Hillsboro?
Yeah, I think you're right. I don't know the specific. I don't remember the specific source of or the funding assumption for that one off the top of my head, but I can find out. It's in there.
Yeah, just South Hillsboro raised. Oh, South Hillsboro, yeah, they pay for everything themselves, but I guess they don't have to all the time. And for Kendall or Jerome on the parks, and I had a conversation with Robbie today about parks issue that a constituent raised with me. And it was McKinney Park, which is in my neighborhood, serves a relatively low income community. It's a smallish park. And one of the pieces of equipment broke and was something her family really enjoyed. And she was told it was just going to be removed and nothing was going to replace it. You know, taking stuff away from people is not a good look. Even if it's an expensive piece, you can replace it with something else, possibly would be an option, maybe. I'm just throwing it out there. But I just want to let you know there is concern in my community about that particular issue. And then, you know, I don't know exactly how it works. I think Robbie told me that, you know, it's unfortunate that, or maybe it's fortunate or unfortunate, but the fact is a lot of the SDCs that go to Parks and Rec can only be used in that South Hillsboro. So they end up with the facilities they have. And McKinney loses pieces because it breaks. And I don't know if there's any way, and I'm just going to raise this issue in general in this room to somehow allocate some SDCs to maintenance of existing equipment, because the fact of the matter is people in South Hillsboro still use McKinney Park at times. So a portion of it could be used, I think, to me, makes sense to say a portion of it should be used in other parts spread around the city because it is used. People who live there use it. So I think there is some justification for it. I'm going to throw it out there. I don't know the mechanics of it. I'm brand new at this job. But when I hear the issues raised in my community, and I'm told, oh yeah, we can't do anything about it. We can do something about it, I think. I would just like to maybe raise that and put it on the table for us. Thank you.
If I could just add really quick before Jerome and Kendall respond, I probably just didn't explain it very well. So SDCs are typically used for new growth, new services, and I think that's why we were talking more about South Hillsboro, as it's newer stuff. You can't put SDCs towards like replacing equipment. I think that's what my point. Maybe you guys can talk about one of the challenges that you have, and then the park system for that.
Go ahead.
So, yeah, thank you for that comment. So, I would say that when equipment does break in our parks, we don't remove it lightly. We typically would like to repair, or if we have funding and that specific piece of equipment is still available to purchase and replace it, we do. But we do have limited funding. We essentially rely on general fund allocations for asset management, asset replacement. So it's for us, it's painful to remove equipment because we know that the community values it. And we do have a program that has a limited amount of money to replace equipment on an annual basis. As Robbie said, park SDCs are limited to expanding our capacity and unfortunately repairing and replacing existing equipment or existing assets. Those are not SDC eligible. And the focus in South Hillsboro, we do have a specific South Hillsboro supplemental SDC, And one of the other limiting factors with that is that the money that is generated from South Hillsboro stays in South Hillsboro in terms of future expenditures to essentially create that new system that we'll talk about here in a little while.
So, follow-up question quickly. When you say expanding, could that include developing a new location within an existing site? For instance, McKinney Park has a very small footprint of actual just equipment, and it's got a court, basketball court, but probably 60% of it is just a field. They took out the baseball diamond. And so could expanding be, in the far corner, we're going to put one of those, adult workout things, there's a different thing. Could that be considered an expansion? And could you then use SDC dollars for something like that?
Yes. If we were adding a new amenity to a park, then yes, that would certainly be SDC eligible.
And I have a question from Councilor Sinclair. She was wondering how accurate the PSU population forecasts that were made in 2013, how accurate were they? Did they turn out to be? Do we know? I mean, I'm sure they've graduated by now. But
I'll do my best to answer this question, even though it may not be as direct of an answer as Councilor Sinclair is looking for. We don't necessarily judge or weigh in on the accuracy of that data. The PSU Population Research Center, which is an entity unto itself there, does provide the official population numbers for the region and for the city and for the state. And in some cases, we're required to use their numbers. The city staff does evaluate other population metrics, census data, for example, to kind of cross-tabulate to see, are we seeing commonality of trends at least, or deviation of trends? And there has been a recent period where there was some lack of clarity or understanding of what those population numbers were. So that's about as best of an answer. I can't say like we feel like they were 98% confident or right or wrong. And at the end of the day, they are also population projections, which they're a forecast. They're not an accurate exact number. In addition to that, I will share that we as a staff are trying to continue to bolster our own data collection. So for example, if we could take the number of residential address points in the city, we know exactly how many units we have. And if we have an average household size of X, we can run our own additional numbers to try to cross-check the PSU population numbers. But just to get back to the heart of the answer, we will not be in a position to say, we believe it's 100% accurate or 97.5% accurate. It's simply just understanding what are their trends and what is that, does it feel like it's reflecting the growth or the number of units of housing or population flows we're seeing out of either other data sources or just in our day-to-day work. Best answer I've got, sorry.
thanks. And she said, thank you.
Yeah. If I can too, just to keep us moving for tonight, this will be helpful as we get into some of the other sections, back to the system development charge or SDC conversations and a couple of other departments. I don't want to steal their thunder because they do a nice job framing it up. There are system development charges that are charged on all new development and that can be used for capacity increases across the entire city. And so that was in part in Jerome's answer and other pieces. In certain growth areas, and we'll talk about this later in the presentation this evening, we have identified a need for additional infrastructure, perhaps that is geographically specific to plans or a deliverable in that area. And so, for example, the parks in South Hillsboro, what Jerome was saying, just to make it really clear, we have a citywide park system development charge that everybody pay, all new development, including development South Hillsboro pays. And in South Hillsboro, there's a supplemental and additional parks system development charge that is to serve parks, the enhanced park plans just for that area. And so that's where, Councilor Harris, just your point, like both were true. There is a SDC component down there that is geographically confined and limited to those components there. And there is a broader SDC conversation and ability to more citywide systems plan funding, just to clarify that. And that'll hold true in terms of some of our other utilities as well.
Just one quick question. So the comprehensive plan, is that something that is required by the SB 100 or is it just the best way to?
It's required that cities have a comprehensive plan and that comprehensive plan contains certain of those policy and program and plan provisions that we've talked about.
Thanks.
All right, I guess I'm up. Good evening. I'm Tammy Wallen, Library Director, and I'm going to share a little bit with about. Let me start that again. I'm going to share a little bit tonight about how the library plans for growth. I know a couple of you are Library Extra fans, so I appreciate knowing that you are aware of our vision, which is to be a world-class system where our entire community gathers, connects, and explores. We do that now, of course, at our two primary physical locations, Brookwood and Chute Park Libraries. We also do that through our autonomous branches, letting people kind of self-service find materials that they're looking for when they're popping into other places where they are. And we do it through community outreach and neighborhood programming, which sometimes looks like the Library on the Loose coming to your neighborhood park during the summer. In other times, it's things like school visits or working with senior centers and that sort of thing. But we work hard to try to find innovative ways to connect and build relationships with everyone in our community to develop resources that will benefit all of them. Next up. So we do not have, as the smallest department, I think, talking with you today here, we don't have a systems plan, we don't have a master plan, but we do have a number of guiding documents that help us kind of stay in touch with what the city's goals are for development and how we can be a part of that. And so I want to review each of those tonight just to kind of give you a sense of where we start when we're thinking about growing and developing. First, in the comprehensive plan, libraries are recognized as essential public facilities and valued gathering spaces. The focus on that plan includes ensuring access to library resources and facilities, including by improving the number of facilities and locations offering library services. That plan also includes a note about co-locating services as a strategy for providing that kind of increase in access. The Community 2035 plan, of course, also highlights where the community places its value on library services. And the action items in that plan include adding small and innovative library spaces to increase access to library resources. So since this plan was implemented, we've already created a couple of those vending machine options that I mentioned before. And we have plans for another one coming soon that I'll talk about a little bit later. That plan also really highlights the community's interest in expansion of all kinds of other library-specific services. So things like continuing the growth of the Library of Things, community learning centers, and cultural programming that goes beyond the work that we already do in each of those areas. And then, of course, we also have our own strategic plan as a department that defines our values and outlines our strategic initiatives. That includes a commitment to providing inclusive and welcoming spaces. It emphasizes the use of data to understand changing needs. So we spend a lot of time looking at what's happening in our community. I've been working with Dan and his team a lot in the last few weeks to think about the numbers of population projections and where that will be and where that will take us in the future. It also, the strategic plan prioritizes expanding our reach through innovative community neighborhood-based library services. And I want to note this plan that's pictured up here is technically now deceased. It ended in 2021. We are working on a new strategic planning process right now. We just got underway with that for a plan that would have us run through 2026 to 2031. And that planning process will include community engagement that will also bring a lot of that voice into the process through some community survey, some focus groups, and some targeted one-on-one connections with a variety of stakeholders in the community. And one thing that's kind of unique to our arrangement is that another guiding set of documents we have comes to us through the WCCLS process for funding libraries via the county. So these intergovernmental agreements and policies and boundary maps are how we decide as a system in WCCLS how to distribute the county funding for libraries. The documents also dictate a little bit about how we can use that funding, that we have limitations on the county funding can only be used for operational expenses and not for adding buildings, for example. These agreements give member libraries some authority to determine the number and location of their branches in partnership with WCCLS to make sure that system requirements can be met. And they set service boundaries for each library. So the funding that we have is tied to the service populations that are determined by the boundaries for those service boundaries. I think you know that WCCLS is working right now on a funding and governance evaluation project that is ongoing through the rest of this year. And there will be new agreements and new service boundaries and new service expectations that are put in place for the next levy cycle, also 2026 to 2031. And that's going to impact service boundaries, base level service expectations, and funding for the library. So this is just a reminder of the structure that we have for library funding right now. 61% coming from the city's general fund, a tiny sliver coming to us from grants and donations, including what the Friends of the Library and the Library Foundation of Hillsboro offer to us. And the remaining 38% comes through the county via WCCLS. And that's broken down there on the right to the county general fund and the library levy. And as I think you also know, the library levy, the current one, expires in 2026. So we'll be coming to the voters this fall to approve a new levy we expect a slight increase in the rate. So our planning for future library services, we are in the very early planning stages for a small self-service library space at the site of the Hillsboro Fire Station. This would be one of those small innovative library services, hearkening back to those documents that I referenced earlier, that would allow patrons to pick up holds, drop off returns, and browse a small collection of materials to take home. The site expands on the reach of our library into that new South Hillsboro area. And co-locating with the fire station there allows us to take advantage of some of the site prep that's already happening there to make it a little less expensive for us to develop that library space. We're also trying to think innovatively about this and looking at designing a space that could ultimately potentially be moved somewhere else. So down the road, as South Hillsboro continues to grow, if we have the opportunity to create a more permanent kind of larger, true library space in that area, we could move our mini library to someplace like Amber Glen or North Hillsboro, where we see the next area growing and need for additional services. So we'll continue to look for opportunities to deliver library services to the other growing areas of the city.
Thanks, Tammy. So given the time, it's probably best to stop here and see, first of all, if there's any questions related to library that Tammy is able to answer. I would just, if you go back 2 more slides, I always like to point out, I don't know if it's for sure still accurate, but historically, Hillsboro has funded our libraries to a much greater degree than pretty much every other library system in WCCLS. I think that's important to note because the City Council has always made library a priority, and it shows the way we fund our libraries. It enables us to do, our hours perhaps might be open longer than other libraries. We might have more services and programs, so it's a point of pride for the city. That number continues to grow. I think just a few years ago, it was closer to 50-50. Now, it keeps going up. And so we're paying close attention to this study, as Tammy mentioned, that the county is going through right now, because it could definitely affect our general fund. So with that, any questions? The next section is water, and there's a lot of information there. So I thought it might be best to stop after the questions now, and then we'll pick it up after.
Just this question. Who thought of the Library of Things? Because it's fantastic.
One of our managers here, Karen Muller, takes credit for the initial idea of loaning cake pans, which back 10 or 15 years, 15, 20 years ago now probably, was kind of what started a lot of libraries of things. And they have expanded and grown around the country. And I will say we've got Brendan Lax is one of our librarians, and that's really his baby. And he's done a tremendous amount of work to really develop that. And it is very impressive relative to a lot of other library of things. It's a great project.
Thank you. Yeah. I know we need to increase the library levy this fall, and I know that's all kind of dependent on the county budget. And so do you have a timeline on when we know what the increase will be?
They are considering increases. Is Simone here to help me out with this one? 37 cents.
Okay.
And it's 22 cents now, correct? So yes,
Okay.
Considering a 15-cent increase. I think they're looking at voting on that. They wanted to wait until additional polling came in May and make a final official determination, I think in early June. So they're waiting until almost as late as they can to make the call on that.
Okay. Thank you.
Yay. Any other questions? All right. Thanks so much. We'll break. Welcome back, everybody, to this really interesting work session about how Hillsboro grows. This is part 2, and I think we're getting into water now, so it's Nikki time. Is that right? Robbie, do you want to say anything? Okay, go for it.
All right. So I'm going to go over how we plan for growth and our other infrastructure needs for the water department, which is a reminder is just for drinking water. The rest of the water cycle will be public works coming up here after I'm done. So we have 4 core missions that we focus on when we're planning for infrastructure. The first one that I think a lot of people don't really think about, and I hear from every employee that starts, they don't realize how much goes into bringing water to people's taps. So protecting public health is number 1. So we want to make sure that the water that arrives to everyone's home 24 hours a day, 7 days a week is healthy and reliable and safe to drink. So it's the Safe Drinking Water Act is the federal law that oversees drinking water quality by the Environmental Protection Agency. In Oregon, the Oregon Health Authority has primacy over that. So even though EPA sets all the rules, we work primarily with the Oregon Health Authority. So then next, we plan for additional water supply. We plan for about 50 years, a little different than some other departments, but you'll hear some themes there about the 50 years and when our last water supply was built. And so I'll talk a little bit more about the current, the Willamette Water Supply project that we're working on and the wrap up of that. Next, after we put the infrastructure in place, we have to make sure that we maintain it. Not only for repairs, but we have aging infrastructure. And examples, we need to replace pipelines that may have been put in the ground decades ago. One of the things that we're currently working on is a cast iron pipeline replacement program. Cast iron tends to be a brittle material and it's older, and we want to get that replaced in our city. So we're working on a criteria system right now that will not only include things like partner projects where we can save money when like a road transportation project goes in, but we'll also be looking at areas of town that have higher social vulnerability indexes to make sure that we're serving our community and not just focusing on replacing pipes where maybe we're putting in new roads, but where there's some older neighborhoods that need that as well. We'll be looking at how frequency of breaks and how that can disrupt part of our community if they're out of water service. So that'll be a project we're working on over the next 2 years. So we always have pipeline replacements, but we're taking more of an equity lens focus on it in the next few years. So we'll come back and present on that at a future meeting. Fire flow protection. This is one that quite a few people I don't think about too much, but not only do we have to meet demands of our community, but we need to be able to fight fires in the peak season. So if we, are in the summer and we have a fire, we need to make sure that there's enough water to fight that fire. A good example is the downtown fire. So, the size of pipelines that would need to go into the downtown neighborhood is about 8-inch, but we actually use our SDC funds to oversize some lines throughout the town. So we have some 12-inch lines there, which were incredibly important to put out that fire, as we used about as many gallons per minute as the whole city of Beaverton was using to put out the downtown fire. Next slide. So the Hillsboro Utilities Commission oversees our enterprise fund and the work that we do in the water department. They are made up of 3 citizen volunteers. They're appointed by the mayor and ratified by city council. They must live within the city of Hillsboro water service area. And they are also, they oversee not only our drinking water, setting our drinking water rates, but also our system development charges. They serve as our local contract review board. So that's why you don't see quite as many contracts coming to city councils. They oversee all of that. And we actually, in water, we have a duty to serve. So the growth forecasts that are planned and set through all the things that Dan Diaz presents to you guys, housing production strategy, different areas set by city council, we serve those areas and then we have to plan for that growth over time. Next slide. So one thing that happens when we have public hearings is many of our members of our community don't realize that we don't get tax revenue. So in the water department, we're enterprise funds, which means all the money that goes into maintaining and building drinking water infrastructure either comes from our water rates that all customers pay or water SDCs. So water rates can pay for anything in our system, but including replacement, all of the things that you guys ask questions about with parks. However, similar to parks, water SDCs have to have very specific rules in Oregon where they can only go for the growth component or the expansion of capacity. Like when I gave that example of going from an 8-inch line, a developer may have to put in up to a 12-inch line. We can use SDCs for that. For the majority of our community, those SDCs are paid one time. Let's say you have a housing development. You pay for that when they put a meter in. They pay their water SDC, and it's based on the size of the meter that they are required to have. Those SDCs I said are set by Utilities Commission. One thing I do want to point out is our industrial customers don't just pay one time. We have contracts with them so that they pay more as they grow. And so that way, if they have a set amount of capacity and they come up close to that, they have to pay a lot more SDCs to go beyond that. So that's one thing that's a little different than your normal customer. And then the only other thing is that we've, tried to take as much of a growth pays for growth model here so that, our citizens and ratepayers don't have to take the burden on of additional development in the city. Next slide. So you'll see a couple of different water service areas here. What we call on the left-hand side are in-town customers. And you'll notice that there's some areas that are kind of in that orangey color, a little darker. Those areas are served by the Tualatin Valley Water District. We serve everything south of Highway 26 and west of Cornelius Pass Road and west of 209th, so the South Hillsboro. That's set by our urban growth boundary agreements in Washington County. And those agreements were agreed to by all the jurisdictions probably a couple decades ago. You may also hear when we're showing rate increases that we have an upper system. So back in the day when you had to go up in the hills to avoid cholera before people chlorinated water, Hillsboro received our water source from the Coast Range. And so you see that blue shaded area. Well, back in the day when you wanted to put a pipeline through somebody's land, and this area has pretty poor groundwater, they would just handshake agreement and hook up to the pipeline along the way. So that's why we end up having all of these customers, what we call the upper system. That system also serves the city of Gaston, the LA Water Cooperative, the park at Hague Lake, Stimson Mill, and many customers along there. Next slide. Wait, I would just pause there to see if you have any questions about service area before.
Was that water?
Yeah.
Was that Hague Lake or was that Barney Reservoir?
That was Hague Lake.
Okay.
Yep.
Thanks.
I have a question about revenue. So, why can't taxes be used?
Well, it's more that enterprise funds can't be used for other things other than the drinking water system. So if you want to go back to that slide. Yeah. So on the water rates, for instance, there are rules that when you have an enterprise fund, like our funds can't be used to, unfortunately, for Kendall, can't be used to go, build park bathrooms or something like that doesn't have a direct benefit to the drinking water system. Now, some communities, rural communities, will do general obligation bonds and use some tax revenue for drinking water. However, I think that you've probably talked about it. Usually general funds in Oregon, based on our tax system, usually don't have a lot of excess capacity for additional community resources than what they're already being spent on. So since we have our own revenue generating model, most utilities in Oregon focus on that.
Okay, and that's a rule that the city has, or is it a Oregon rule?
I'd have to check with Suzanne and Michelle on that, but generally, I think it's government accountability standards. When you have an enterprise fund, you don't spend those funds on other things. I know there's been some other cities and jurisdictions that have gotten in some court cases because they did spend their enterprise funds on other things outside, and their general fund had to pay their water fund back. So
Right.
I'm assuming it's state and federal, but I'd have to check.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, and I was thinking the other way. Like
Yeah.
we I know it is an enterprise fund, but can the general fund pay into it?
Yes, I believe legally the general fund could pay into it, but
Oh,
then
it
you
could. Right.
probably lose resources for parks equipment, things like that. So.
That's gonna upset
Okay. All right. So next other than we have to plan for pumps and pipes and in-town finished water tanks, but in addition to planning for the infrastructure that directly delivers water to our customers, we also have to plan for source of supply, treatment of that supply, and transmission delivery of those supplies. So I'm going to talk a little high level about that. And that's really where we talk about the 50-year planning cycle for source of supply. And in our basin, the Tualatin River basin, we're a rain-fed basin. So what that means is we don't have snow melt that gives us water supply, and we don't really have a groundwater system that backfeeds our river. And I'll talk a little bit more about that because it becomes important for stored water and other supplies. Next slide. So this is our source water service area, and it comes directly from the Joint Water Commission's Source Water Protection Plan. So we have a source water protection plan. We built a geodatabase about risks to our source water and things that we can do to mitigate those risks and work with landowners and different businesses to avoid any risks to the treatment at the Joint Water Commission. So during the winter months, when it's raining, we end up having enough stream flow that we're able to pull what's called natural flow and feed our treatment plant that way. Next slide. However, when it stops raining, you may have noticed we've had a nice spring. Well, I'm every day checking because then we will get what's called regulated. So the water master cuts us off a natural flow when it gets down to a certain amount, and then we have to rely on stored water. We have stored water in Barney Reservoir, and this is actually at the headwaters of the Trask River that flows to Tillamook. And back in the day, some of the founders in Washington County, mostly from Hillsboro's leadership, went and looked at different places they could build reservoirs, and there was a perfect depression up there where we could divert to the headwaters of the Tualatin. Initially in the 1970s, it was built for 5,000 acre feet with City of Forest Grove and Hillsboro, and then it was expanded in the late 90s. Tualatin Valley Water District, City of Beaverton, and Clean Water Services joined the Barney Reservoir Joint Ownership Commission, and Hillsboro has a little over 5,000 acre feet to utilize in the summer months from that reservoir. And because it's up high in the Coast Range, it's also very cold, so Clean Water Services uses it for their permit requirements as well. Then we also have Scoggins Reservoir that was built in the 70s, and that was a partnership with the Tualatin Valley Irrigation District. It's owned by the Bureau of Reclamation, and we have contracts for stored water in that facility. We were actually planning in the early 2000s and before that to raise Scoggins Dam for additional water supply for Washington County. Many things happened where in about 2009, Hillsboro led an alternatives analysis to look at other options. The costs within a few years had quadrupled, and they had found endangered species within the inundation zone of the raised dam. And so from Hillsboro's perspective, we thought we should take another look at this. Also, the federal government isn't too quick on building things. You can see they still are working on that safety of dams for seismic. But we determined that the Willamette water supply would be the next best option. It's a good thing we did that because in 2015, we hit our capacity at the Joint Water Commission water treatment plant. We did a small expansion to get us to where we are today, but our projections actually were pretty accurate. And some of those are based off of some of the population projections as well. So we have about 5,000 acre feet in Scoggins Reservoir, and these are the stored water supplies that serve our community in the peak season. Our average regulation is around June 3rd, but it can last anywhere from May to June all the way to November, December timeframe. Next slide.
Scoggins is Hag Lake, right?
Yes, yes. I don't know why we always call it that by the dam name, but it's been that way since I started working here. Yep. So as I mentioned, 2009, Hillsboro led an alternatives analysis with all of our partners, and we identified the Willamette River as the next best option for Hillsboro. We looked at our motivation was least risk, least cost option. So we looked at not just cost, but the lower risk of all the different options. So we started that project. I think it officially began in around 2012. And it takes about 10 to 15 years to build a water supply. And it will be coming online in early 2026. I think I'm on the schedule to come back and give you guys a more detailed presentation on that. I think in November is where we're at for that right now. But we will have about 25% initially on treatment plant ownership out of 60 MGD. We can build that treatment plant up to 120 million gallons per day. And we also purchased a water right from the city of Salem. One of the reasons we did that is new water rights, if you're in a drought year, they're either on or they're off. So in the drought year 2015, you might remember we had a really warm summer that year. So if you got a new water right, you wouldn't have had water for about 105 days that summer. We didn't think it was prudent to be spending over $500 million of our ratepayer money and not having water supply. So we negotiated with the city of Salem and acquired 56, which is about 36.2 MGD. This will get us out to approximately 2070 to 2080. So you'll see that another 50-year time frame period. Next slide, unless there's questions on that. Okay.
So I do have a
Yeah,
question.
yeah.
So I didn't know about the investigation into Scoggins Reservoir and trying to raise the dam.
Mhm.
So what I'm hearing from you, and I'm not trying to make a joke, is that it's cheaper and easier to run a pipe from the Willamette River to Hillsboro than it is to raise a dam.
Yes and no. And back in 2007, when I started to work at Hillsboro in 2007, and the dam raise project cost around $250 million. Within a couple of years, it had raised to about $1.1 billion. And it had all of the other risks of the endangered species. We also did an investigation on the reliability, and there wasn't enough water to fill the dam, so we would have had to pump water from our intake at our treatment plant all the way back up to the dam to fill it. There was a lot of concern about permitting on that as well, and the energy costs associated. We tried to rely on gravity as much as possible.
Yeah. Thank
And
you.
that was just for the dam. We would have had additional costs for the treatment expansion and all that. So, yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And here's some just specific examples of our resiliency planning. Most utilities across the state are really focused on resiliency. The Oregon Health Authority included in their master plans now that you have to plan for resiliency, such as earthquakes, wildfires, and such. But when we talk about emergency repairs, you'll see one of our operators out there. That actually happened during the air show. I don't know why things always happen during events or holidays, but we had a leak on our north transmission line. A valve had failed, but luckily we were able to isolate it very quickly. And then we've had
Great shot.
Yeah, it is a good shot. He hates me using it. And then last summer, you might have heard about the wildfires on Lee Falls Road, which is very close to our upper system slow sand plant. All those trees around our pump station burned, but we had worked with Gaston Fire and to make a defensible space around that, and then worked closely with Chief Downey to make sure that Fire Command was protecting our infrastructure there. We're also seeing an increase in droughts, and 10-year flooding events tend to happen multiple times a year. So that's something we deal with on a treatment basis. And we built a standby power facility. Gosh, I think it was around 2014 or 15. I'll have to check on that. But this was really critical during the wildfires of 2020. We didn't have power supply for over a week, and we got down to about 3 days of fuel storage. But luckily, PGE came in and was able to deliver us fuel at that time. Right now, we're looking at expanding our fuel storage at the facility to make sure we can make it a little bit longer. But that tends to be one of the most frequent emergencies that we have are power outages during the wind or ice events like that. But these are the types of projects we're always planning on. Our capital project is not just growth, but making sure we can deliver water all the time.
And the chemical piece, I remember during COVID, there was a chlorine
All right. Yeah.
shortage.
And multiple emergencies that year.
Yeah.
We had we didn't have a chlorine gas supply at that time.
That's right.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah.
What's the next one? Oh, sorry.
I'm sorry, just can you help me with something? I've been looking back through the slides. What is MGD? That
Oh yeah, sorry about that. Million gallons per day.
okay, thank you.
What's after the Willamette supply is done? What's the next big one? you guys are
Well,
thinking?
our next supply. Well,
Give it a minute.
yeah, give it a minute.
It's coming online next year.
Yeah. Well, what's next for the supply, or what's next for a supply after that supply? Just so I understand.
That one, the latter. Yeah.
Well, we do have different options. We did study a groundwater well field up near Scappoose. And we would have to either go through the mountain there or hill, or we looked at going through that tunnel. It became some issues there, but there's definitely a groundwater supply in that area that we could tap into. We looked at one at Savi Island. I'm just telling you where water is. Yeah. But because of the natural resources there, it wasn't the best option because of the wildlife refuge and things like that. But there aren't going to be many water supplies after this Willamette supply. Most of our rivers in Oregon are over allocated, and so we'll likely rely on conservation and efficiency as long as possible before we go build our new supply. So, yeah. Thanks.
So Nikki's talking about pulling the water out of the rivers. What we're talking about is what we do to protect the water that we put back into the rivers here with our storm and sanitary systems. These are two separate utilities, but I'm going to start off talking about these a little bit together because they are both regulated under the same thing, the Clean Water Act of 1972, which really establishes the standards for water quality and the items that we put back into the rivers. It made the EPA as well, the regulatory agency that sets those minimum standards. And if I could go to the next slide. It really kind of establishes permitting, a requirement for permitting for all new development. So want to make sure that anything that they're doing on a development isn't impacting the environment. We want to make sure that we're protecting the wetlands that are on the property. And they're also required to minimize measures for managing stormwater. That can be as much as saving soil and making sure soil isn't getting into the system and getting into our waterways. Go ahead, next slide, Jan. There's a layer of permitting, just like with water. We have the EPA issuing the NPDES permit, the National Pollution Discharge Elimination System permit. That is actually, for us, issued to Clean Water Services. And you'll see them 2 layers down. Clean Water Services is our district agency, and they own our regulatory permits and are responsible for ensuring that us and them are meeting all the criteria of those permits. We also have DEQ issuing a storm sewer permit, or the MS4 permit, and 1200 Cs. Those also are issued through Clean Water Services, and we become implementers of the regulations. Clean Water Services really has the authority to kind of set minimum standards for maintenance and operation of the facilities. Our design and construction standards for our storm and sanitary utilities originate from Clean Water Services as well. There's a very symbiotic relationship with that agency here in Hillsboro, and similar to our roadways, which is my more comfort zone here, is they operate some of the main lines that we also have in the city. So not every pipe that functions throughout the city, unlike maybe water, is maintained by Hillsboro as an agency. With that, if I could flip to the next slide. This one's in a lot of detail, and we'll get into this more when we get into the utility sessions. I think the critical thing here is because of that relationship, there are utility fees that are paid both to Clean Water Services in the utility bill for the maintenance operation of the lines that they're responsible for, as well as the treatment plants and the oversight. And then we also have a monthly charge, which was just updated and increased in January for the operation and maintenance of the facilities that we take care of in the city. Next slide, Dan. And this is just kind of giving you an overview of what the various components are. The pipes are probably something that makes sense to you. For sanitary sewer laterals that service the homes are maintained by private parties, we're responsible for the main line into the system. And then Clean Water Services is responsible for the system that treats before it discharges into the waterways. Important feature of this, which you may have heard sometimes with Portland, when you get rainy events and you get overflows, we don't run a combined sewer system here in the city of Hillsboro. We're fortunate enough to have designed so everything is separated. That is not to say that we don't occasionally have problems in our sanitary sewers from water. You get over time as pipes degrade, you get infiltration, you get cracks, tree roots get into systems. All that has to be maintained over time. And then you'll see the secondary system, stormwater, also piped. Property owners responsible for laterals, but you have things, catch basins that are collecting on the roadway, and then you see the treatment facilities, which are really trying to remove those particulates before they actually hit to the storm or the waterways. Next one, Dan. So I'll separate these out now. We'll talk about the stormwater master plan. So the city adopted the master plan for stormwater in 2021. It is tied to growth, And it's also modeled with both this and the sanitary sewer are modeled in conjunction with clean water services. Again, very similar to transportation is we need to make sure that the decisions that we're making are in sync with our partners' builds and goals to accommodate the growth. This one here is a 10-year program which identifies capital improvement projects, stream enhancements, and some water quality improvements. Next slide, Dan. And really, the key to this is meeting the performance standards through collection of debris that gets into the system. Things that you may not think of as stormwater management are your leaf pickup programs. So we don't want leaves getting into the pipes or into the catch basins and creating particulates. Street sweeping is the same thing. We want to pick up as much as we can before it hits into the storm sewer system. But we want to collect it, we want to move it, we want to treat it, and then we want to release it. And that's really what this whole program is set to, and this master plan is set to do. And that you can, I'm not going to get into the details, but you can see there's a lot of, by the numbers, a lot of assets there that we are maintaining as a city for each of these types of endeavors. Next plan, Dan. The master plan also identifies a number of capital improvements. You can see like Jackson School Road, we just recently completed, it was done in conjunction with the widening project. Lincoln and Second, we actually is a paving project. It is a reconstruction for our pavement management program, but it's one of the places where we take opportunities just like Nikki does. I don't know if we actually, are we doing water with them too? So,
Yeah, probably.
So we're taking opportunities before we put a new surface on the roadway. We're going to rebuild the systems and make sure the underlying utilities are of good quality condition so that we don't have to cut up the roadways after. So that is one of the other plans that is underway. And then you can kind of take a look at some of those others on the list.
Can we go to the two slides? Yeah. So in the treat column, these are these are also owned by the city.
There are some that are owned by the city. There are some that are owned by individual developers and or property owners. It depends on if they're private or public. So generally for industrial customers, commercial customers, they have on-site private facilities that they're responsible for maintaining, and then we will do inspection and enforcement to make sure that they stay up to code. And then you'll see public ones, case in point, Jackson School Road, you will see on the planter strips, water quality, what we call lighted facilities, low impact development facilities that are there to treat the water really at the point where it's coming in, because the goal is not to move water too far from its source of where it's coming into. So lighted facilities have become very popular over the years.
And are any of these owned by Clean Water Services? Within, yeah.
Off the top of my head, I don't know of any regional that are
yeah.
locally, but that isn't to say that there are.
Yeah. Thanks.
And then just a couple highlights of some projects that are pending or hopefully to be pending. So the Glencoe Swale Culvert replacement is a massive project of which we presently have still, as of right now, a $19 million potential federal grant to come in to pay for that. It is replacing of an undersized culvert that goes under Glencoe and the railroad tracks in Quarry Street. It is unfortunately one of the reasons why we are seeing some of the backflow into Harewood periodically, because the basin is not large enough to hold all that water and it can't flow through fast enough down the system. And then there's another smaller project on Minter Bridge Road. And that one's going to be funded by our individual dollars.
Can I ask you a quick question on that one? Maybe it's not a quick question, I'm not sure. Have you studied to see what the effect downstream from the Glencoe Swale Culvert releasing all that water so quickly in a major storm event versus holding it back a little bit? Because downstream from that is a pretty big wetland area. Mackay Creek, Dairy Creek is down there. A lot of homes on that area too. Have you taken a look at the effect of that?
They have done a whole entire stream corridor study, but I do not have that expertise in my brain. So we'll have to follow back up with you on that if you want more detail.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And then we get into sanitary sewer system. We also have a draft of a master plan that is pending. You're going to hear a lot more about this in detail, probably more towards the fall. It again is identifying capital projects, operational needs, and maintenance needs for the next 10 to 15 years. Next slide, Dan. And again, it's trying to hit our performance standards, making sure that we're inspecting and cleaning the lines accordingly, that we've got capital projects that rehabilitate our lines. As I mentioned, we do still over time get infiltration from groundwater into our sanitary sewer system, which can overwhelm the treatment plants if it's not addressed. So they have to be rehabilitated. I think we're in the middle of doing what we call some pipe bursting projects downtown, where we're lining some pipes underground without actually having to dig up the road. Very cool process. And then we're also we have programs that are just more informational or trying to keep things from actually getting into the system. So we don't want fats, oils, and grease, or fog, as we call it, to get into our system. It clogs it up, it creates backup, and reduces the capacity on our pipes and is hard on the system. Next slide. And again, here are a number of capital improvements that we have identified that are going to be coming up in the plan. And again, we will get to these in more detail when we do a detailed discussion of the utility. Next slide. And then just a couple other highlight projects. So Main Street project was going to be replacing about 2,000 linear feet of pipe. It's going to be also going to do some upsizing. So we often do that in a project where we try to produce a little bit more capacity in the line. And then another project that's coming up on Walnut Street and 14th. And I think that's my last slide. Yes.
Just a clarification. You'd mentioned that we don't have combined pipes. What does that mean?
So in the city of Portland, being an older city, they built one pipe to handle both storm sewer and sanitary sewer. And the problem with that is because of our rainy weather, we can easily overwhelm the pipe system. And you hear about the discharges into the rivers in Portland. That is why. So it's not a friend of ours to get groundwater or rainwater into the sanitary sewer system. So if you overflow stormwater quickly, it's a little bit different than overflowing storm and sanitary mixed together from an environmental standpoint.
Any other questions on, we have kind of one main section left after this about our target growth areas. So before we get into that, any other questions about any of the utilities? Or there's going to be a lot more to come. So again, this is very high level, but I think it at least shows maybe the complexity and the things we have to consider as the community continues to grow. So if not, then we'll go back over to Dan.
Mind if I jump in real quick, Dan? I just want to say thanks to the staff and the work you do on this. I know we're not done, but specifically, Nikki, to the water department. I've been to the Midwest and was in a town where it was a permanent boil water order. Permanent. There was no other option. The cavalry wasn't coming. Water wasn't going to get better. And it was apparently a very common thing. And my son said, I can't wait to get home to Hillsboro. And so I think I've expressed that to you, but I think sometimes we take water for granted, especially the quality of the water we have here. And I just want to say thanks. Yeah.
Thank you. I have to say the water in Oregon is really good.
Okay, so home stretch. So we talked early on about the master plans that have been covered so far this evening are really citywide. And a lot of the newer activity, new development, new installation of utilities goes into what we refer to oftentimes as target growth areas. And while there's development oftentimes happening all over our city, there are certain areas that either due to specific city plans or targeted efforts, or perhaps maybe it's an expansion area, we tend to see an increase in activity and the increase of the importance of the coordination of not only the planning, but then the implementation of those areas. So this map really seeks to highlight what we refer to oftentimes when we're talking about the target growth areas. They include downtown, where we see some regular and continuous redevelopment and reinvestment activity. North Hillsboro that we've talked about in the past, and where we see the industrial and the employment expansions. Orenco Station, and we'll come back to that because Orenco Station is actually getting ready to probably come off of this list, given that it's been recently built out over the last 15 years. But we're seeing the final stages of Orenco Station. A lot of current activity in the Amber Glen, as some of you may recall from your tour earlier this year. And Tanasbourne as well is one of those areas that is starting to mature and kind of finish out. And then areas that we've been talking about really in South Hillsboro and Witch Hazel Village South on the southern parts of the city. But it's one thing to just kind of show it and call them out by name, but really to give a qualitative aspect of it, each of these areas are contributing to community's goals stated in the 2035 community plan. Each of them are contributing to trying to provide some of the housing capacity and choices that the community and you all have laid out in plans and policies, or expanding our economic base. And so these just show some pictures of those different areas. This is what really goes from this high level concept planning across all of our different areas and really makes it real and becomes part of our community then it exists for decades to come. And so you can see between the activation in our downtown area, the new middle housing going in the South Hillsboro, the completion of the plaza in the platform district at Arenco Station on the right-hand side there, and then the dense, higher density multi-dwelling housing going in the Amber Glen area as examples. So then we wanted to pair that qualitative piece with quantitative, and I will flag early on this slide, these come from what are called TAZs, or transportation analysis zones. And so these projections are a best attempt to try to quantitatively show where we believe current population, back to the PSU question earlier, so many of these are population projections, and also planned population growth is. Similarly, where is current employment? Those are jobs, and where's projected employment, looking out really over those 25-year windows. And so you can look at different target areas and see, in some cases, the current and the planned might be quite close, or in some cases might even be a slight reduction. Whereas in other areas, planned population might be significantly larger in the 2045 estimated timeframe than it is today. South Hillsboro is an example of that. And the reason for that is because we know that there is planned capacity for new housing units. And much like we talked about at the last Hillsboro 101 around housing, we've seen the production of that housing continuing in that area. And we know that there's still quite a bit of capacity. We're about 60% built out, but down there and including Witch Hazel Village South. So this is, again, just to kind of give a sense of like, where can we and where do we expect to see more housing units coming on board en masse, or where might we be seeing the additional growth of jobs in our economic base across some of these different target areas. So to bring it back, we've talked citywide too, and when we think about these sub-geographic areas and neighborhoods, oftentimes it'll start similar to the graphic that's here on the right-hand side, where collectively as a bunch of city departments, in partnership oftentimes with community partners or other entities, we will start to identify the need to go in and plan for the redevelopment of an area or plan for the expansion of an area, as is the case like in South Hillsboro and Witch Hazel Village South. And it'll start with just general geographies. Where are we generally thinking? What's contiguous to the city? What's contiguous to the existing infrastructure and master plans like you've heard about this evening? And we'll start to identify those areas. Where might there be receptivity of property owners that are willing to try to come in and maybe change the current uses of their land? So it starts very rough. On the right-hand side, the orange outline is the full extent of the South Hillsboro area. And then on the left, in the upper part, blue is the Witch Hazel area that was planned in the late 90s and early 2000s and really built out through about the early 2010s. And then you have in the red on the left-hand side, the Witch Hazel Village South area. We'll talk about that here more in just a minute. And then you have some of the future urban reserves down there in the blue. And then the green is the reserves golf course that also is part of the urban reserves. And so we start at levels like that, then ultimately working towards, and we'll talk more about this here in the next couple slides, what's in the lower left is the very specific neighborhood plan, in this case for the Reeds Crossing Town Center, which we've now seen over the last few years come out of the ground, is getting ready to have the grocer open and the like. But this really then seeks to underpin the importance of no one department and no one utility or no one team from a staffing standpoint and in an expertise area can enable our community to successfully plan and deliver on any one of these neighborhoods or subsets of our community. It really takes quite a bit of coordination to not only do it at all, but then to really do it well and maximize synergies and efficiencies of planning a transportation network, perhaps out of the transportation system plan, with the trails network that Kendall and Jerome talked about, and making those work hopefully in great coordination with each other rather than very disparately. And so this map builds upon the orange footprint on the last slide, and you can see there's a lot more detail in this map. So this is what we would refer to as a community plan concept map. So in here, the different colors, blocks of colors, are really signifying different densities in different land use designations or assumptions. And so the darker the shade of the color indicates typically a higher density of housing, whereas the lower shade of color would be a lower density of housing. And so you see a bunch of different shades and colors laid out around amenities and transportation systems, really to try to blend those different housing choices that you've heard about in the housing production strategy and the housing needs analysis, to hit the different types of housing and the number of units that we're projecting the community needs and that this area can deliver, and to really try to do it as efficiently as possible. One of the things that, going back to that early Oregon land use system map, there's one of the goals of those 19 goals we talked about is goal 14 that talks about urbanization and being efficient. And there's a lot of times a misnomer that, you know, the Oregon land use system in the urban growth boundary is intended never to be expanded. Everything has to stay inside. And that's just fundamentally, and from a policy standpoint, not true. What it was seeking to do is to encourage maximum efficiency of the use of the land and the provision of infrastructure and the like. And so we'll show you a little bit of, it goes from putting colors on the map to then what really ends up happening on the ground. Also on this map, and I'll kick it off to my colleagues to see if they want to add anything here, is you'll see blue, a bluish purple color on the map. Those are public facilities of different types. Most of them on this map are the schools. So we will partner in our infrastructure and service planning, much like you heard Tammy talk about with libraries and our parks, also with the school district, to try to co-locate schools with open space and parks and recreation facilities, or the transportation system, and trying to find an environment that's maybe a little bit more safe and compatible, and also trying to nest them around different parts of this broader community plan. And then lastly, and you'll see a better example of this when we get into the Witch Hazel Village South example, we call out critical open space and green space corridors. And you see those with the blend of blue and green on the map, really using existing environmental features that are there before we think about urbanization, trying to preserve and protect those. That is where our goal 5, significant natural resources, you've been a part of conversations, comes into play. And we start to overlay that to balance the preservation of those areas, but also still trying to then maximize the density and utilization of the land around it. And we walk a very fine balance there. And so that all starts to take shape at this community plan level. I'll turn it over to the peer department just to see if there's anything they want to add in terms of the concept planning here. Then we'll shift about how that also then informs the finance plans for those specific areas.
Yeah, so thanks, Dan, for queuing that up. So, you know, I have to say, I came to Hillsboro right as the South Hillsboro Community Plan was wrapping up and being adopted. And coming from having worked in other jurisdictions where that kind of planning just flat out didn't happen, to seeing essentially a blueprint for a complete, connected, and green community, that was the tagline here, was super exciting for me, because literally my first week on the job in Parks and Recreation, we were going to talk to a property owner to purchase what would become Century Oaks Neighborhood Park. So all this work that led to creating the blueprint, and you know, I'll just kind of highlight the bullets on the slide here. 6 neighborhood parks, 1 community park, a community center, trails and greenways, all kinds of open space, 15 miles of trail, a complete budget for all of those improvements, including, as we discussed earlier, the base citywide SDC, and then the supplemental SDC to be able to generate the revenue to deliver these projects was incredible. I would say also that having the developers fully on board with this plan was critical, because typically when a new area like this opens up for development, the developers are much more agile, literally and financially, to take advantage and purchase literally all of the available property here. And for the developers to work with us right out of the gate to recognize that it was important to deliver this park and open space infrastructure was a massive advantage. I also recognize that my predecessors were extremely successful in acquiring from the private property owners close to 70 acres for the future community park in South Hillsboro. So this really paved the way for all the success that we've had in South Hillsboro over the last 9+ years.
And I'll also add, he's not going to toot his own horn, but they were also able to complete 4 neighborhood parks. They have one additional park that's currently being designed. We have a future community park site that we've acquired. We have 6 miles of regional and community trails. And then we also work with the developers to add additional amenities like off-leash dog parks, community gardens, bike parks, skate parks, and splash pads as well.
Dan, when you're talking about efficiency, I hear density, but it's more than that, right? It's the planning that Jerome was talking about.
Correct. It's really all of those things.
Yeah.
It is density. It's trying to get the greatest utilization, because in many cases, like in an expansion area, South Hillsboro, we actually, if time permitting, we have a conclusionary piece that actually shows photography of what we're talking about here.
Oh, that's great.
But it is, especially into greenfield expansion areas, we are converting from a open space, natural, maybe farmed, maybe stands of nursery stock trees, whatever, to something else urban use. And so we really try to comply with, how do we try to get as much housing then out of that? Because we're making that acknowledgement of we're changing the overall utilization and character of the land. But it isn't just numbers. It gets back to quality, to Jerome's point.
Livability as well.
We can deliver a parking or a parks program and level here that fully meets the city standards, at least for this sub-geography. Now that, to Mayor Harris's point earlier, leaves other areas of the city that are existing built out that we also have to continue to bring attention into.
Mm-hmm.
But it is the full efficiency of like the services, that complete community aspect, and to achieve things like maybe Matt will talk about here, meant to this transportation infrastructure also is designed now with the bike and ped master plans that you heard about earlier in place. So we have some of the greatest concentrations of cycle tracks and sidewalk facilities interfacing with the trail systems to provide a safer, more connected transportation network locally and broadly as well. So that's what we're referring to.
Thanks.
And I'll add, if I may, anybody who's been down in this area does recognize the density. I mean, there's a good diversity of housing types, but it is extremely dense. I think we certainly recognize, but more importantly, the developers recognize the importance of these parks and open spaces because of that density. People have literally, in some cases, no backyard to go to. And working with the developers, we've created this outstanding system where people have easy access to recreation opportunities.
Can you tell me what the additional SDC was per unit or per hookup or however that was charged?
Did bring that.
And the other,
So the base citywide SDC for single family residential unit currently today is $7,400, give or take. The supplemental South Hillsboro specific SDC for single family units is just under $14,000.
so I just want to point out that this stuff is not free.
Absolutely
It
not.
costs $14,000 per unit, increasing the cost of each house. It's a fine trade-off, but the developers pass that on. Okay, so let's keep that in mind when we're talking about affordable housing. And I'm not saying it's not the right trade-off. I'm just saying, let's keep that in mind.
You sound like you do. You sound like you're saying it's the wrong trade.
I'm saying that with the cost of putting up every new door in this city,
Mm-hmm.
the city has certain leverages that it can use to help reduce the price and make it more affordable for each door. Zoning, density, maybe some building code modification, pre-approved ADU plans, for instance. Could work with the state building code. Systems development charges is one of those.
One of the tools.
One of the tools it can use. It could be that we still want neighborhoods like this. We do, by the way. We do want neighborhoods like this. And a neighborhood like this should be available for people who live in Hillsboro. But I also don't know that the city should become one of the primary developers of housing in the city. I would like to be able to market to produce as many doors as we can in this city. And so as we look at these tools or leverages, I just want to make sure we understand that this is a cost that gets passed on, is all I'm saying.
Yeah.
Councilor Harris, and as we move on, well, we're going to give another example here in just a minute, but that is precisely the reason why we're hoping the opportunity to present, like in this particular Hillsboro 101 training, is so important, is because everything that gets included in the various plans you've talked about, there is cost associated with it. And that was an underlying theme that we heard in the very first Hillsboro 101 around finance and budget. You heard in bits and pieces tonight. How those plans get delivered, there is always a cost associated with it. We try to be very thoughtful and coordinated, and this should come forward in future planning and policy decisions that you as a council may also make to try to frame and evaluate those different trade-offs. If you want one of the most complete transportation systems with maxed out dedicated bicycle facilities, in addition to sidewalks, in addition to the most robust parks plan of any sub-geography in the city, there is an additional cost associated with that. And then we break it down into, now is that largely being funded by system development charges for the new capacity, and then user fees, if FTC, to Nikki's graphic of like the split water cup, that is what these plans are, not just about the how efficient, how pretty are the colors on the map, how complete of a community. With them, we bring forward the finance plans to go with them as well, because that is critically important to understand the costs to somebody to deliver that. Could be a cost to the city, could be a cost to the developer that is likely getting passed on to a renter or an owner, to the business community that's also trying to make a business case to come and locate in our community, any one of those. So that is part of the job that you should see folded into all these different plans, and where you might be faced with trade-offs of what is it that you want, and why looking citywide is important, but also why sometimes sub-geographies can and should be different as well, so long as it's intentional. The last piece I'll just add to that is we have to defend our methodology. So that point about the financial consideration that goes with these concept plans as we refine them from just a single color blob on the map to more detailed infrastructure plans like this, is it not only helps to determine what is going to be the cost of doing that work here, to Jerome's point, it will inform the way staff are negotiating the delivery of some of this infrastructure. Most of the infrastructure, I'll look to my peer department entities here, most of the infrastructure across the city, let alone like in an example, South Hillsboro, is delivered not by the city. It is delivered by the developers and then inspected and accepted by the respective city utilities and departments. And so that too becomes very important to think about, how are we negotiating parks, getting that to be a public park, but the developers purchased the land, gave it to the parks department, improved the land, gave it to the parks department. We then give them system development charge credits. But if they were to not buy the land, deliver the park, and give it to us, we have to have a funding mechanism by which then Jerome and Kendall and team are out buying a park and hopefully coordinating that with transportation and fire and others. And so that's a bit of the efficiency as well, to Mayor Pace's question earlier, that we seek to deliver, whether it's in a relatively large greenfield development here, or the same way when we're getting into a very established neighborhood like an Amber Glen or a Renco or downtown, trying to do the similar work. It just, the complexities and the scale there shifts pretty drastically. So I hope that helps. And that is one of the key takeaways we hope the council are taking out of, especially this Hillsboro 101 presentation. So under the ground, this is kind of what would be at the surface level, but it carries all the way through. Nikki can speak to the water piece, but this is the water master plan for South Hillsboro, and you can see it, the lines and the geometries follow very similar to what you see here, in large part because they are going within our rights of way. And so we have to think also three-dimensionally, up above the ground and down below the ground, as we deliver these master plans. And Nikki, I don't know if there's anything else you want to add in terms of how we planned and then negotiated the delivery of some of the water in South Hillsboro.
Yeah, and so some of these lines, as the neighborhoods go in, the developers do deliver what they're required to do for development. But this is another example where we're able to upsize lines, do the SDC funding to meet, let's say there's a school down the road that's not built yet, or potential community center where we're able to get that done. it works pretty well, and we have reimbursement agreements with them so that we can get that done. One additional thing that isn't included on here is that we are looking for a reservoir site in this area, and that's because this part of town doesn't have an emergency storage, so that if ever there's a significant earthquake or something, we want to ensure there's fire flows and emergency storage to distribute water to the area in this community. So.
Where is the rest of the city have emergency, or does like each neighborhood kind of?
So at
Sorry.
Glencoe and Evergreen, there is, you see those berms along. That's our Crandall Reservoir right there. So we have storage there. We may also eventually build ASR where you inject water in the winter down and then pull it out during the summer to save money on not having built so many tanks. We have one at 24th Street, and then we have a lot of storage out by our treatment plant at Fern Hill.
Oh, okay. Yep. Excellent. Thanks. Slight panic. Where's the rest of it?
Good question.
So I'll just echo some of the comments on the transportation side of things. South Hillsboro was developed, like we talked about, very expensive infrastructure costs and high quality, but was really developed with a lot of sophistication, a lot of funding sources, collaboration with the county, as well as the developers, of course. So there's a local improvement district. We leverage some MSTIP funds. There's the county's transportation program that funds a lot of the projects of countywide significance. And as well as the transportation development tax, which is operated through the county, we of course developed the supplemental TSDC charge. And when I joined the city a couple of years ago, we took on the task of just updating that, and the complexity of just updating that was incredibly complicated. But to some of the points made previously, we do really look to the development community to deliver a lot of these projects. They can do it more efficiently. It's a win-win situation when Hillsboro collaborates with developers directly to develop these things. And so that's still ongoing to this day, but there was a lot of work put into this and a lot of sophistication, and frankly, a lot of cities look to Hillsboro as a model for how to do these kind of large scale developments.
So in a very similar fashion, we won't hit this one because it's again, we try to learn after each one of these planning efforts and then do it hopefully better the next time or build upon what worked well. And so Witch Hazel Village South, while very proximate to South Hillsboro, you can see a very similar type of approach. We took the growth area, started as a big red blob on that earlier map. We started to evaluate it, worked with the property owners, and then we laid out the infrastructure. So you see the black dots. The major one with the arrow is the extension of Brookwood, heading south through the existing Witch Hazel neighborhood, eventually connecting to River Road, which is on the lower left. But the real reason why we wanted to flag this one too, and this came up in a recent housing subdivision application, is we really do try to look through the environmental side when we go to these areas too. We're required by state law to plan for our natural resources, but we try to not only plan for those, but make them add value to that point of efficiency, to the point of, okay, if we can have an activated park next to a natural park, or that connects into a trail corridor, that's for a broader system benefit, not just the new residents potentially that are moving into this area. And so we establish those natural resource overlays in a very broad brush approach, as you've heard. And then when the development comes in, we seek to protect those areas, but they're refining with each individual development application exactly where that boundary falls. And if there's a finger that needs to get impacted, well, there is a means by which that can get impacted and then mitigated. But we try to keep the broader environmental system still very much intact and protected. And so that's why there is a bit of a holistic look, but then a piece by piece look. And so that's what really we're flagging here. This will be 1,000 units or so, a little over that, recently annexed into the city of Hillsboro. And here's just an example of when you pull away those other pieces, just the natural resource layer, and then how that's interfacing with the neighborhood parks. And Jerome, I don't know on this one too, if there's anything additional you want to add or just keep moving.
No, I think, yeah, that's well said, just in terms of leveraging the location here, not co-locating with schools like in South Hillsboro, but here it's co-locating with these creek corridors and greenways. And the benefit there is that there's also local trail connections as well as regional trail connection along the east side of River Road.
And then ultimately, the goal is we will get to this. Comes out of the development concept. And so now it might be a little hard to see because of the aerial photo underlying, but you can see the individual units laid out over this area. And you can see the individual unit types that get relatively small in the upper right, which are really a blend of townhouse and attached units, so that when you hear middle housing now coming out of those other policies, here's the real manifestation of it. And that's the important part. It isn't planning for planning's sake. It's really planning to make sure, are we delivering the different types of housing, hopefully hitting different price points, to Councillor Harris's comments earlier, and really adding things to our community that are of value add. But keeping in mind that once these communities get built, then our utilities are there and we go into maintenance and sustaining mode, and that becomes important as well. So time permitting, I'll look to Rob and the council. There is a piece that we have been starting to maintain. This is one of those areas, to the comment earlier, we're trying to get better at how we use our data, how we track the success of these plans and the growth. And it's something that we call the growth snapshot. And this is a freeze frame of that, but if the council would like, I'll switch presentation. It actually goes through from about 1970 to today. And if we want to run through that, it'll take a few minutes. Let me just switch over.
It's well worth it. It's a really cool tool that they've been putting together, and kind of gives a good perspective of all the growth that's happened. And now you can see that it's been very planned out. So while he's pulling that up, any other questions? This is the last thing that we have for tonight. Any questions from anybody?
Super fascinating. Yeah. And just the thought, I mean,
I've always known this is a very thoughtful city. It's why I got involved when it's why we moved here. It's why we got involved when we moved here. But good grief, this is such a well thought out city, and just when there's opportunity. So thank you for all doing all that work so that we can see that after all these years.
And after this, you'll all be professional level Sim City players. You can go home and you're ready to go.
Hey, Dan, when is Witch Hazel South? When is that coming online?
So it is in the land use application. So it's been annexed to the city already, and they are coming in as we speak right now with basically the subdivision to create the additional lots, which will be the precursor to then coming in for the building permits and starting construction. So that is underway right now.
This is Councillor Sinclair. I have a comment observation I'd like to make. It is very appreciated during a work session that staff has brought together such a great presentation that outlines the legends to the maps that provide greater awareness of how our city shaped and what those numbers look like. And I want to thank Councillor Harris, or President Harris, for his input, because these presentations are giving us such good information. It's okay to have a fair observation like that, so that we're being aware and having those real conversations as life gets more expensive and more difficult for affordability. And I just wanted to say thank you for such a good work session.
Thank you, Councillor Sinclair. So as we launch in this, I couldn't help but notice in Councillor Case's comment, she talked about the opportunity. And one thing that staff have often held, and this is what this presentation, the story map I'm about to flip through, really the last 55 years or so highlights. Many people on the outside sometimes will look at Hillsboro and say they're lucky. We're lucky to have award-winning Orenco Station. We're lucky to have Intel. We're lucky to have the Hidden Creek Community Center. We're lucky that South Hillsboro is going the way it is. We're lucky for the vibrancy of our downtown. And there's a lot of areas that we need to continue to work on. But there's an old quote that, luck is really that intersection of opportunity and preparation. And so hopefully one of the takeaways too is that Nikki was talking about water master planning, from the turn of the century. Is this is not one council, one staff, one person. It's a continuity of this community trying to think through what it wants to be, trying to be as realistic with that. And then collectively the teams working together to then find ways to plan and ensure that happens the best it can. So these plans really play a part of that preparation part. And then some of the opportunity we can generate, but sometimes that will come unsuspectingly or maybe with some indication of from the outside. And that's what really this seeks to highlight. So what this presentation does is just summarize the evening. In the 1970s, a lot was happening. major water master planning pieces up, especially in the Scoggins and Barney reservoirs, were being finalized with a water supply that was unlike really any other in the area. Similarly, as you may recall, in the 1970s, the state's land use system is taking shape, and all this is starting to happen there. What we didn't talk about is the changes to the tax structures in full service city. And at the start of the 1970s, Hillsboro was the county seat, but you really see these maps will kind of run through by decade, but they stay pretty consistent. Our city geographically was made up of what's green here. There was no Reedville or Tannisbourne or Amber Glen. There wasn't even much of a Beaverton. And we were really, people sometimes still think of us as the edge of the Portland region. We were actually a independent piece unto our own, really, for the last part of the 1800s and early 1900s. Many of you know that history. But what we wanted to capture here is, with the shaping of these different policy and planning landscapes, in very specific and intentional conversations between the community and the council and the staff at the times, how some of these types of planning pieces were put into place, and then how that has reinvented and refined itself over time, bringing us to today. And then the question becomes, over the next 4, 8, or 20 years, what role collectively will these efforts play? And so in each one of these, as I pan through the different decades, the orange outline is today, as of about April 1st of this year, city limits. The green, the darker green, because you'll see a light green here in the middle, I'll explain that when it pops up, is the city limits at the start of that decade. So again, our downtown lower left, you know where that's at. You see where this is at. We weren't even annexed out to like the airport area yet, for example. And at that time in the early 1970s, you can see on the left-hand side, we'll have the population and acreage to start. And as the data becomes available, we start to bring in employment, we start to bring in tax revenue. And so you can see the correlation of some of those pieces as well.
This is going to be a video, right?
It's kind of like an animation, like a flip book. We haven't gone full video yet because there's some data kinks to work out. So when you go forward 10 years now to the 1980s, as I noted earlier in the slide, early 1980s, Metro becomes established as a regional form of government, somewhat as an offshoot of the Oregon land use system, but really taking over those regional duties. Metro urban growth boundary at that time now becomes the lighter green. So you can see where that's at. In the 1970s, mid-1970s, early 1980s, we are also creating our first comprehensive plan, like you heard about this evening. It was at that time, and with the city even then being a full-service city, saying, we better do land use planning here, but we want our own additional tax base. We had largely been the county seats. We had heavy governance, economy sector. We had, department stores in our downtown because we were our own thing. We weren't just some, fringe suburb. And then we were really relying on the agrarian economy around us, and then what was happening in downtown Portland. But think about, not nearly as connected as we are today. And so you can go back to those comprehensive plan establishment conversations, and the council very intentionally said, we want to add an economic base. We want to zone lands for industrial beyond just what's in the southwest part of downtown, right by Jackson Bottom, very traditional type of industrial. We want to position for future opportunities. And so it was really those community plans, much like we were talking about tonight, that started to set the stage for then what really transpired and what the identity of our community has become and evolved in over the last 30 to 40 years. So you can see the population just in that decade alone increased 82% to 28,000. The acreage increased by 25%. And you'll see we start to expand really to the east and to the north, somewhat because that was the part of the broader region, but also because that's where some of the synergies of the market and some opportunities that I'll show you here in just a minute come. You can also see that at that time, there was a lot in the UGB units created that was vacant land. So everything that's green, light green, between the dark green and the orange, and I'll show you a slider of this in a minute, was horse tracks, farmland, open residential areas, and the like. So the 1990s, now some of those plans are really starting to take shape. Intel starts to emerge, both at the Aloha campus and then coming into Hawthorne Farm and Romler Acres. And you start to see that easterly expansion into the North Hillsboro industrial area, and then into the Amber Glen Tannisbourne areas, which had been master planned by Standard Insurance and Principal Financial as their own kind of master plan communities, and then started to annex into the city of Hillsboro. Our population increased 34%. You can see that there. And now we start to be able to get city assessed value data. And so our assessed value in the 1990 was 1.2 billion. And our acreage change, given that expansion into the existing urban growth boundaries, was a 84% increase at the same time. Fast forward to the early 2000s, our population increased. Now, these 90% increases are decade over decade. That's not going back to 1970. The population really continues to expand here, 90%, as you see, north of 71,000. We start to collect and have available to us employment data for the city. And so our first baseline employment data comes available in 2005, and we're about 58,000 employees, largely starting to take shape in our downtown core, which had been the historic commerce center, but really starting to take shape in the North Hillsboro, Amber Glen, Tannisbourne area. And you can see our assessed value has increased from just over 1 billion to 4.5 billion. But the acreage trend you'll see starts to shrink at 12% now, not 30 and 40%. The 2010s, population increases another 30% over the last year. We approached 91,000. You can see the employment changes increased about 5,000, and the assessed value is nearly doubled again to 8.3 billion. You also see the byproduct of very intentional annexation policies. So what had been kind of started to be a amorphous dark green city limits layer as different properties are, voluntarily annexing into the city based on the plans we had done for the Ronler Acres, the Orenco Station, the Amber Glen, Tannisbourne areas early on. It was in the early 2000s where some of those islands, like you see here, those light colored green spots, we said, okay, that's a service inefficiency area. Technically, Washington County Sheriff's providing public safety to those, even though Hillsboro Police is responsible for all the properties around them. So it was one of the only times in recent history where the city went out and coordinated with those property owners, but basically forcibly annexed those islands to make a contiguous city limits going into now 2015. So you see a true solid green block showing the city limits in the service areas there. Our population growth is still going, but slowing down to 16%. Employment growth has expanded significantly at 18%. And we've seen even in 5 years, another 2 billion of assessed value start to be realized with some of that development growth area. The new colors that show up on this map now in the 2015s reflect the urban reserve planning. That was a new thing in state law in the late 2000s. And many of you have already heard the history of this. I won't get into that again this evening, but we had worked with the region and the county to plan for our urban reserves. And then the House Bill 4078 came in and modified those and changed those pretty significantly. So the dark blue or the blue color on the map are where we have urban reserves as a byproduct of that series of decisions. The orange areas that you've already heard and seen about are those areas that we had planned for urban reserves, but that as we sit now as a byproduct of those decisions are not urbanizable and able to be planned for a 20 or 50-year horizon for our community's needs. We go to 2020, I won't go through all the numbers here again, but you can see kind of the consistency of some of the growth and the numbers continuing to increase. The acreage is slowly growing. That's really just with those expansion areas. And South Hillsboro starting to show up down at the bottom of the screen, and so is Evergreen North up in North Hillsboro. And that brings us to 2025, and this was a snapshot that was in the PowerPoint that was sent to you all. You can see where our population, our employment stand, and what at least the last 5-year change has been since the start of the decade. And then I'm going to bring us to, this is the projections. So these numbers start to reflect now what is contained in our current housing needs and economic opportunities analysis that you heard about earlier in today's planning. Much of this is what starts to find reflected in Nikki's water master plans, as she's maybe looking to for sure 20 years, if not 50 years, and also what starts to get reflected in a lot of those other master plans you heard about this evening. And then I'm going to keep moving down because we switched just a little bit. So to give you a flavor back to the target areas conversation, this is what that means to our community. So think about the farmers markets we talk about in Orenco Station, in the vibrancy and the new people that move into our community and how many of them kind of move into an apartment or a townhouse in Orenco Station or somewhere else. This is the aerial photography from 1970. We've outlined in green the Orenco Station Town Center area. And this is the aerial photography as of the start of this year. So here's the platform district where Orenco Fest is held. This is the main part of Orenco Station. You can see Ronler, Intel Ronler, obviously, and everything around it. So this gets back to that point about efficiencies, Mayor Pace, to your question earlier, of significant changes to the landscape. We all collectively hold a pretty big responsibility then to make them a pretty worthwhile transition in terms of the goals and the desires and the needs and the character of our community. So just to keep us moving, similarly in our downtown, So our downtown is a regional center. You'll see oldest part of our town, right? So here's the aerial photography as of the 1970s. And then the aerial photography basically at the end of 2024 and going into 25. Not significant footprint changes, but definitely revitalization activity, but it shows a matured area. The capacity and the significance of that growth can be constrained depending on the market. You know, is somebody willing to sell their existing commercial building to let something more intense be built there? Come back to that in just a minute. Here's another pretty shocking one, just to keep flipping through of the target areas. Here's Amber Glen Tannersborn, Highway 26, up here on the north end. You can see some of the farm to market roads that became Cornell Road or 185th Avenue here. And then here's Amber Glen Tannersborn, the nearly 10, at least 5,000 units of housing and the growth that we saw kind of in the late 90s and the early 2000s with that expansion to the northeast. Similarly, Amber Glen's gone through like a generation 2.0 now. It came in the early 1990s really as an office park. Many of you probably recall that from the tour. The dot-com bust kind of really hit commercial real estate, kind of like we're facing here in the early 2020s. And we went through at the Amber Glen community plan update to really allow mixed use and higher density housing. And you see a lot of that starting to be built out now. Only a couple more, then we'll be done. So just to bring it back to what we were talking about earlier with Witch Hazel Village and Witch Hazel Village South. So this is that incremental progression. So this is Witch Hazel that was planned and brought into the urban growth plan in the late 1990s, really was under construction through the 2000s. And then this kind of boot shape is the Witch Hazel Village South that we talked through just a few minutes ago. And you can see the number of townhouse and middle housing units that we were delivering in the early 2000s. Again, we will continue to update this and ultimately show then where and how the Witch Hazel Village South area would potentially come in and contribute as well. South Hillsboro, same thing. You can see the existing areas of below us. Some of this photography is from 2018, just depending on where we had certain flights. So that's why the color and it doesn't look quite the same as maybe the Orenco area. But this was at the start of our planning in 2018. And then you can see where we were at as of last year with the town center and the Reeds Crossing area really taking shape in the Butternut Creek area. The library site and the fire station that was mentioned earlier is here. And then that community park location that Kendall and Jerome mentioned that we acquired was also down in this area. So we'll continue to monitor that as that changes. North Hillsboro, just quickly the same. You can see the original airport roughly around the time we sold it to the Port of Portland for $1. And then you can see to today in terms of the expansion out of that growth, really from industrial policy and land use policies being set in the late 1970s through today. So it brings us just back around to close out for this evening. We have Ronler Acres too, but I'm going to bypass that because it's very similar to North Hillsboro. It gets almost maybe too summarized and brought up to too high level, but if you look at the different trends and the byproducts of the planning and the policy making, the population, which really is, we think of it kind of as like residential growth, is shown in the light blue, and from where we had the data from 1970 and tracking that through. You can look at the employment data and the growth there. Now, beyond 2025, you see those spikes because those are correlating to those recent updated planning and projection numbers. And then you can see the assessed value number, which we don't forecast out, but we do bring through current because those are actual numbers. And so when Robbie was making the statement at his city manager's report earlier of the importance of how we continue to think and blend the land use, which affects our property tax base, that is what the assessed value is really determining, is how are we keeping pace with growing that in as close of an effort as we can to try to maintain ongoing services and ongoing infrastructure, especially those that are general funded, or when Tammy is going out in Washington County for a local option levy, that is hitting property taxes. And so if we're growing our property tax base, that increases the opportunity if that passes for revenue generation. So we'll end on that evening. I appreciate the chance to see this. We can send this link out for folks if you'd like to play with the sliders and stuff as well.
I do have a question. If you look historically at employment and population, it tracks, 80% or so. But now looking out, what it was at 20 years? I can't remember what you said. Now it's a population of 144,000 and jobs of 147,000. I guess that's if we don't expand or whatever. But why is there a sudden jump in the share, number one? And number two, if it does what what your projections are showing, what's the impact on our community going to be?
I'll do my best to answer those succinctly here, given that it's 9:15, but the population or the employment projections you see here reflect our economic opportunities analysis. There is a piece in required state planning that we are engaged in trying to get refined, where employment density by use type is still very much a thing. There isn't an acknowledgement of you can have facilities with different employment densities that are also needed taking up acreage or contributing to tax base and the like. And so when we evaluate our target industries and the growth, we have to put employment growth assumptions with them, but that also correlates into what is the overall economic growth in the facility needs. So case in point, if office buildings are seeing 24 employees per acre, let's say, and a manufacturing facility is at 18, but automation is coming in or work from home is hitting and those numbers are reducing, but you're still trying to grow your economic base, you start to see difference in the numbers. And so we do believe we need to see the employment growth here, Councilor Harris, to your point, but some of that additional growth is a byproduct of the methodologies that go into our economic opportunities analysis and how those planning projections happen. The overall impact to the community is something we're working on, but it's far more difficult to track of what is the demand on housing. And that becomes more difficult too. And the importance of regional planning is in economy, people will live in a region and commute or change jobs. And they might work in Beaverton for 5 years and then all of a sudden get a different job or get laid off and get a job in Gresham. And so that moves around. When we think about complete community planning, we're constantly trying to produce jobs and economic activity and investment in our community and housing. But to other conversations we've had in the past, we can't always guarantee it's like a closed loop system, that it's going to be a one job created for one household or for one population growth. And so there are times where we plan for what we believe and desire our economic expansion to be versus what we're also planning for in terms of our share of the regional housing piece.
Yeah,
Hope that helps answer it.
Well, it's a start. I mean, but I guess the issue is if you have 144,000 people vying for housing close to where they work, that's going to drive up the cost of housing. So if the city focuses on job creation and development, but we don't have the housing available to do it, then aren't we putting ourselves in a position where we're driving up the cost of living for the people who live here? I guess that's my question. And maybe it's a stupid Econ 101 type observation I'm making there, but I think that if this is the direction that we're headed, we need to plan for this. We need to think about this, and Metro needs to give us an answer, and the state needs to give us an answer on this as to how they can help do this. But I just think that you pointed out correctly so that the city's done a wonderful job of long-range planning. I was here when Dave Lawrence put Ron the Rakers together. Brilliant piece of city management, which was very long-range looking. And it was one of those opportunities meets hard work sort of thing, right? And now are we looking at creating a problem for ourselves by focusing too much on economic development in the city if we don't have the places for people to live here? Or are we going to rely on, well, Beaverton will build enough houses, Sherwood will build enough houses? I mean, I guess that's a conversation I think that's worth considering, unless there's maybe a very simple answer I haven't thought about here.
I'll add, it's a really important question. It's one that every city in the state of Oregon wrestles with. So next week when we propose our budget, it'll come up because you hear of a lot of cities and counties around us that are looking at double-digit millions deficits. And while there's lots of reasons, one of the biggest reasons is because of Measure 5 and 50 that essentially cap the amount of tax revenue that cities and counties can get from property tax. And residential, when we won't go too much into this, but when you look at what 1,000 units of residential development does for a city, it's not nearly enough to cover the services for that 1,000 units. And so that's the pickle, right? And so if you're right, we don't want to have too many jobs if we don't have the housing. But if we just have the housing without the jobs, then we're not gonna be able to pay for the residents, which is what other cities are facing. So I think it's a great question. It's one that I think we've been trying to bring up, and other cities agree that you got to have the mix. And we're fortunate to have to good planning over the past 30 years of people that have come before us, and they're doing it now. So it's not. I don't know if that answers your question, but I think the state's land use system and the state's property tax system, I think, drive a big part of the problem that you bring up.
And the goal is just to give tonight's presentation as a baseline, because those are the kind of conversations over the coming many years in housing and in economic development space and the maintenance and planning of our infrastructure. We have to continue to think about and address here, given those different pieces. And in my short answer, Councilor, to your point would be, we need to think in both ands, or yes, not either or type of a piece. Because you can look at pure communities that are only delivering housing, for example, and that is just as risky, if not more risky. And so that's why it will take us thinking holistically. It will take us not just simply trying to recreate the past, but re-innovating again for the next 20, 30 years.
Yeah, and what made me think about it was that last graph. And I actually, in my head, was doing the math between 2015 and 2025, looking at job growth and population, going, oh my gosh, we're catching up here. And historically, I don't know whether that's been a good balance or an out of balance thing because of 5 and 50. I'm just thinking, just looking forward, I guess, asking the questions. I know you guys have thought about it because you guys clearly know what you're doing here and talking about it.
Fair question.
Thank you.
If there's no other questions, I just want to say thank you again to the staff. There's so much work that goes into these, and great job to everybody for doing that. So thank you.